Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Shirley Adrain. Hi Shirley, nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to me today. Shirley, tell me a bit about your background and your career in banking. How did you get into that and why did you leave?
Well, I got into banking, I think after university, I studied psychology. I was always worried about money and I was always thinking, how am I going to make some money? But I still thought I'd be a psychologist. And then after my first degree, I realized the options to do a PhD were really for focusing much more on drug counseling, alcohol counseling, and that wasn't the area I wanted to go into. So then I did a master's in business IT systems because at that point IT was a very new thing. And I went into IT. And then after a couple of years, I managed to get into banking IT. I was not an expert in IT. I was not a technical person, an arts graduate with IT background. We really helped working with clients. So we weren't the detailed programmers. We were the people who worked closely with the clients and helped them find solutions.
Why did you decide to leave that career and what did you do?
Well, I've been working in banking for 20 years and I'd worked very long hours. I traveled around the world. I worked in Wall Street in the 90s. Then I worked back in London, then Singapore. And then we moved to Hong Kong. And then I wanted to have another child. I had my daughter when I was nearly 40. And then I was determined, like a project, that I was going to have another child, which obviously doesn't come easy when you're in your 40s. And that project was not going very well. So I'd gone back to work after my daughter here, but I just wasn't really satisfied as much as I'd been before. The role wasn't really as challenging as my previous roles. So I decided to step back and focus on having another child. And at the same time, then I started to look for another career.
Were you able to have another child?
I was.
Oh, right.
It was not easy.
I bet. Oh, good.
I had him when I was 45, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, we could do a whole nother podcast on that. That would be super interesting. Then you decided you wanted to have a career change. And
Yes.
What did you consider? What kind of things?
Well, for the last 5-10 years, I was the chief of staff and chief operating officer in my roles in banking. And that was where I was really helping people and their leadership journeys. I was helping the leadership team. I was also doing things like, a headcount reduction and budget management. But the thing I enjoyed the most was actually helping people. So really helping people manage their careers. And I got a lot out of that. And I also had some coaching and also rolled out some coaching across 2 of the organizations I worked. And I really enjoyed that. And I found that people were coming to me and asking for advice. And I thought, I wonder if I could make a career out of this. And it took a bit of time for that to happen. So I did some formal coach training. And then I went through the long process to become an accredited executive coach. and I had my child at the same time. And
Good for you.
it took a few years and quite a bit of pro bono work until I started actually set up my company and getting paid for it.
Then did you decide to specialise in helping people get back into the workforce after leaving their work for marriage or children or illness or for whatever reason? Was that an area you decided you want to specialise in?
Well, it was an area I was doing some work in, and a friend of mine had set up Back to Work Hong Kong. We met and talked about it quite frequently. And then she moved back to Australia. So she said to me, can you please take over my company? And so that's how I started running Back to Work Hong Kong. So I had been coaching returners, but then obviously since I took that over about 2.5 years ago, I've been working with a lot more with returners.
What is the philosophy behind Back to Work Hong Kong?
It's to really help anybody who's had a career break get back into the workforce and to encourage corporates to actually tap into this resource pool, because so many corporates here would much just rather have people who are already in jobs. So they're not necessarily recognizing the benefits of having people who've had a career break and hiring them back.
What are some of the benefits of having somebody who's had a career break?
Well, they're much more focused on what they want to achieve and having that balance with work. They're usually very motivated to work, get back into work and to really give years of their time at work. They know what it's like to have a break. They recognize the skills and then they're ready to come back. And usually they're ready to come back full time and are very committed.
What sort of person are you typically working with? So is it mothers who are coming back after having children, or is it a whole range of different reasons and people?
It's a whole range of different reasons. So mothers and fathers, and sometimes they've not thought about coming back and circumstances have meant that they've had to look for a job. And other times they're very focused and that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah. You run career management programs with these women. Is that separate to your coaching? Like, do you run sort of group programs as well? Or is that part of the one-on-one coaching that you do with people?
We run group programs for up to 4 people. We run programs every month, and then we also run individual programs. So it really depends. Do they want to take part in the group program, or do they want to actually have one-on-one coaching?
Oh, that's so cool. And what do your group programs look like?
We have 2 sessions within a month. So in the first session, we give them some pre-work, and then they come in and they talk about, look back on their career and think about what they want to do next. So, really get a deep dive as to what the skills might be and what their drivers for going back to work. And then they have some more exercises to do after that. And then we have the second session where we'll really focus on things like the CV and the interview technique and really create a plan for them to get back to work.
Do you find that most people want to have a complete career change, or are they often looking to go back into their previous careers?
Well, sometimes they come up to me and they say, I don't know what I want to do next. I can't go back to what I've done before. And they don't aim very high. And then when we spend time with them, they realize that actually they've still got the skills that they had before and they could go back into what. So they've created all these barriers in their minds that are preventing them from actually achieving what they can achieve. And we help break down those barriers.
What do you think are some of the issues that prevent women from getting back into work, specifically women here in Hong Kong?
A lot of it is around recruiters. Recruiters, are given a challenge to, hire somebody quickly, and it's much easier for them to find somebody who is already in a job. Hiring managers, also, they find it easier to have someone who's already in a job. And there's biases around the expectations that women who've had a break are not committed, they're not going to put in the number of hours, they've forgotten how to work, so they've forgotten their skills.
Or their children will draw them away from work as well, which is, very, very unfair and doesn't always happen.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an age sort of that you typically work with men and women in this sort of area, or can it go across all ages? And do people suffer from ageism as well, like getting back into the workforce, people feeling they're too old to be up with the latest trends of education or whatever?
I think that can be a part of it. Ageism can be a part of it, and there are some companies now that sort of help more seasoned employees get back to work. But we do work with younger people as well. And we work with people who've just had a career break for different reasons, or else have just, want some support in a structured way to get back into work. Because we have a lot of people that we can connect them with. Sometimes people the first thing they do is update the CV, or they apply for jobs on systems like JobsDB, where you might apply for hundreds of jobs and never hear back. And that can be really demotivating.
What can you do to ensure that somebody is likely to get that first interview?
Well, we take them through a process, and the interview is very much at the end of this process, because often what people do is they come to us and say, I've got a CV, here it is, and I've just tacked on beginning career gap. And that's where we say, okay, let's take a step back and look at what are your key skills, what are the talents, what's the value that you bring to work. And that can take a bit of time to get the confidence back and to really walk through that and understand what value they can add. And we also try and change the narrative, because they're so used to being somebody's mum. That is what happens so often. You've had that narrative for years. I am Hugo's mum or whatever. And that's what you say when you meet people, and everybody knows you as Hugo's mum. They don't actually know that you're a trained accountant with 15 years experience, because you're not telling that story. So we get the people to really think about that story, and when they meet people, to say something that's relevant to their skills and experience. And then people often help people here. I find Hong Kong is a great place for using your connections to get back to work.
Do you find that you're able to sort of reach out and connect people, and that if people actually start telling a different story about themselves, it builds up their credentials and also their self-confidence, and then they become more hireable?
Yes, definitely. I think of an example a couple of years ago of a lady who, was an insurance expert, and she had a 10-year gap, so she thought she probably couldn't get back. And I met her at an event, and then I spent a bit of time with her, and I introduced her to two people that I knew were insurance experts here. And she had lunch with both of them. And just having lunches with them made her realize that actually her skills were still up to date. She could still talk a good job. She just hadn't done it for such a long time. And after she'd had these lunches, reassessed her skills, then she contacted her previous boss from 10 years ago. And that's a key thing that I think for helping people get back to work is your previous bosses don't think of you as a mum. They think of you as the person who used to work with them. And they don't expect you've lost your skills. So he immediately rehired her when she had contacted him. And now she's been working there for over a year. So,
So there's real value in going back to your old boss and speaking to them first.
Yes. I wouldn't speak to them absolutely first, because they are one of the best people who can get you a job.
Right.
So I think you have to get your narrative right. You have to feel confident before you approach them. And that's
so going through your process first, working through each of the steps and changing your narrative, building your CV, looking at your skills and talents and what you have to offer in the workplace. I guess you've got to sort of also look at what's new in the workplace and how things have changed from when you were there. Is that something that you focus on as well? Because in many areas of work, there's such a big difference from 10 years ago to now in what's going on in the workplace.
The technical skills are generally what people say is the biggest thing that they notice when they come back, so technology has moved on a bit. But that can be the same as going from one company to another. And certainly I noticed that from going from one job to another. You've got to learn the new platforms and different companies. So you're not necessarily any worse off than somebody else starting a new job.
What are some of the fears that people face when they're having to re-enter into the workforce after being out of it for a long time?
Well, some of the fears are around that they've forgotten how to interact at work, that it'll be too stressful for dealing with children when they're at work. It's generally around confidence. And generally, I find that they come back and they're on an absolute high for the first few weeks, because they realize, actually, it's just like I've been away for 2 weeks. That tends to be something, I hear. And it was the same. I had a 2.5-year break. And when I went back, it was as if I just had a couple of week holiday.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It's like riding a bike.
Yes.
You just pick it up, don't you, so easily.
Yes.
Do you continue to work with people to help them acclimatise into the role once they've actually got the job? Is that part of what you do?
Yes. So I met someone yesterday who started work in August. She'd had a 10-year gap, and we talked through some of the issues. I mean, she's doing great. But I think it's good to have somebody you can speak to when you just say, how do I deal with this part of the politics? This is a bit different than before. And we just help support them through it. So, and I have another person who had a 10-year gap, and she went back nearly 2 years ago. And I still do executive coaching for her.
Oh, right. Brilliant.
And she's actually just moving on to her second return to work job.
And that must be a real buzz for you when you successfully help somebody to reintegrate into the workforce and they're enjoying it and it's going well. That must be really rewarding in your job.
Yeah, it's the absolute highlight of my job is when somebody calls me and said, I've got offered the job. Especially when they've had a big gap. It's just really great. And especially if, they've been in a difficult circumstance. And, for someone I worked with recently, and I've known her for a while. Our daughters are the same age. She was not planning to go back to work, but her husband left her and she was here. And when that happens here, you can't just go off back to your own country, if your partner wants you to stay here and the children to be here. So that is what happened to her. So she really had to have all the stress of dealing with children, having to get over the whole emotional issues, so it's been a tough few years for her. And we sat down in August to look at, she decided, I'm going to go back to work now. I really need to make a plan. So we made a plan. And then about a month later, somebody offered her a job through LinkedIn. This is the first time I've ever heard of somebody being offered a job through LinkedIn when they didn't even apply for one.
That's brilliant.
I know. And I said to her, this is absolute karma. You absolutely deserve this. I was so happy for her.
Isn't that wonderful?
And it was a really good job as well.
Oh, that's so fantastic. Mm-hmm. And have you been giving her emotional support along the way, as well as giving her sort of direction and confidence to apply for jobs?
I think that's a lot of what it is just really being that support person. Because there's a lot of instant messaging, WhatsApping that goes on,
And because I guess a lot of people are coming from difficult circumstances where maybe they've got divorced, maybe a partner's passed away, maybe the children have all left and gone to university.
Yes.
So it can often be a time of real change, can't it, when people are coming back into the workforce and you need sort of a skill set just to cope with the emotional fallout.
Yes.
Do you find that can be tricky sometimes? Difficult supporting people through the emotional turmoil of what they're going through, the changes?
I think it can. And that's where, as a coach, we're quite clear on our boundaries. And sometimes, if it's a therapy issue, we would recommend that. So we don't try and take that role. So I really help on supporting them on the work side and just really focusing on their confidence.
And then you'll refer on if you feel that they really need sort of emotional support. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's brilliant. What sort of things are companies doing in Hong Kong to make it easier for people to get back into the workforce? Are there any sort of affirmative action programs for people who've been out of the workforce or people who are a bit older? Or is that something that doesn't happen here in Hong Kong?
It is happening, but not as much as in other locations. So, a few companies here run returnship programs. So where they actually advertise for returners to have had at least a couple of years break. And then they put them through a 3 to 6 month program and hopefully offer them a job at the end of that program. Now, we see that happening a lot in other locations, a lot in the UK, the US, Australia, not so much here. And what I find particularly frustrating is companies who say they have these global returnship programs and they don't run them in Hong Kong.
Right, that's interesting, isn't it? So is there anything that can be done about that?
I think as part of what we do is to challenge employers to tap into this resource pool. And I think that it is changing because look at gender pay gap reporting, look at Me Too, look at the clients are now saying to these corporates, they need to have a diverse slate of candidates.
They need to have
They need to have gender balance. They want to be seeing women leaders. They want to be seeing women, dealing with these clients. So they do not want to just having all white Anglo-Saxon men. So that's where companies have to really set targets and they have to really focus on getting more senior women in. Part of the way to do that is to pull returners in.
And hopefully we'll see more of that happening as people become more aware and they become better educated, and we've got people like you pushing them to make these different choices. Hopefully that will evolve more because we are an aging population. So more and more people who are older are looking to stay into the workforce, and that's a global issue at the moment, isn't it?
Yes. And it's a big issue in Hong Kong. I think in Hong Kong, only 55% of women are in the workforce. So we have really low workforce participation rate here in Hong Kong.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah. So many women leave for childcare issues, and our elder care. So in getting them back in, there's just not the programs in place. I mean, Singapore has programs in place to get women back into work after they've had childcare or elder care leave. Hong Kong really struggles in that area.
What sort of tips would you give for employers to tap into this resource pool? What could they do to access people who are returners?
I think they can have returnship programs. That's one way to do it. So it's a very structured program. Now, if they don't have the capacity to do that, then they can definitely speak to hiring managers and they can speak to recruiters and say, we want returners. And I've found that companies who've done this and they've maybe just hired one returner, they've found that this person's been really committed, they stayed long term, and they've just added a lot of value. And then they've gone back to recruiters and said, I had a returner, I want more returners. So even trying it with one person and then they'll probably get a few more.
So it can have a knock-on effect because it can be a positive thing for the workplace.
Yes. And definitely for multi-generational workforces, it's really important to have that mix.
And it's
talent.
so good to have that wisdom and experience at the top end, isn't it? You know, there's something to be said for us older women and older men in the workforce, because we bring a skill set and we bring a level of empathy or communication or understanding or whatever it is that some young people don't have. I mean, I've certainly changed a lot in my 50s, just in the way that I view things and the way I operate and the level of calmness. And, you know, there's many positive aspects, I think, to getting older.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're not as valued in the workforce as we should be.
Yes, that's right. And I remember when I was younger, I thought, you know,
silly old buggers.
If you're over 40, you've absolutely not got drive and ambition.
Yeah.
And if you're over 50, you're absolutely past it. Whereas, you know, I am 50. And a recent study showed that actually women in their 50s and mid-50s are actually supposed to be the best leaders because of some of the characteristics we have and that we've learned by this age. So really, one of the least used resource pools when companies are looking to hire into a senior position. Women, you know, in their 50s are not the ones that they're looking for, but they should be.
So why do you think there's a stigma against hiring women in their 50s or 60s? Is it because we are seen as not being as energetic or being more emotional? Is it linked to menopause? Is it because it seems like we only have a short time in the workforce and people want longevity of their hiring?
I think a lot of it is bias, because when we think of the person as leading a corporation, senior leader, so many times we're thinking of a grey-haired man. So really there needs to be more female role models, and that's why I find a lot of my senior women clients, when they're applying for senior roles, so people who are working and are applying for senior roles in their organisation, they tend to apply for one job, and if they don't get it, then they want to leave and they come to me and say, can you help me find another job? And that's because they don't see these role models, whereas men see lots of people like them in the leadership team. So if they fail the first time to get a promotion, they will keep on going because they know they're going to get there eventually.
Yeah.
So women's confidence really can take a bash, you know, trying to get into these roles. And yes, menopause for in our 50s is definitely an issue because it gives us anxiety. I think
for most, many women.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. But it shouldn't be something that limits us in the workplace, which is a shame because it goes on for so long for so many women. I mean, I had to put up with it for 9 years. I'm only just coming out of it through ridiculous.
But I'm sure you still have a huge amount to add. You know, have a huge amount to offer. The value that we have and the energy we have, it does not go when you hit 40s and 50s.
And there's something to be said for the level of confidence and the experience and my ability to make decisions. And, you know, there's so many things, so many skills that I have that younger people don't necessarily have, or they don't have that level of experience in. So I think that we're not valuing the experience of older women as much as we should in the workforce, and we don't really recognize what they bring. And sometimes we're looking at the outer package, or we're making assumptions, or we have biases which aren't necessarily true. I guess it's stereotyping, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And that's where I like working with multi-generational teams and really seeing what they can learn from each other. And reverse mentoring is a great way to do that as well, so that, you know, we learn from millennials, they learn from us. That can really help just, you know, create that level of understanding and break down biases on both sides.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea, and companies should do more of that. That's a really cool thing that I hadn't thought about, reverse mentoring, where you're learning, because the young ones are coming out of university with all these new skills and, you know, talents that we didn't get when we were at university, but we have a wealth of experience which we can transfer to them. So it can really be a quid pro quo situation, can't it?
Yes, definitely.
It says here in your bio that you've been through menopause. And so has that given you a greater insight into the challenges that some of your senior clients have had and how to help them?
Yes, because I realized like the anxiety part that I had, and then I realized this is due to menopause. Then it dawned on me of some of my clients. They were having these anxieties, but they were assuming that that meant that they had to change jobs, that the job was too hard for them, that they'd lost the skills and that they needed to change jobs. So that's where we kind of walk through and say, actually, are you going through the menopause? Because if you are, you have these anxieties, you have these hormone imbalances, which we sort out eventually. But once we understand that's what it is, then we can put that to the side and say, okay, I've got this wealth of skills and experience, and I'm still, I still have a lot to add.
Yes.
And if I'm having a bad day, then, you know how to manage your time. You don't have meetings in the morning if you're up half the night, is one of my tips.
That's a good tip, because your sleep can be really disrupted through menopause because of the hot flushes in the night.
Yes.
So I guess, it's about recognizing where you're struggling and then compensating for that and realizing that you can still do your job and do it well. And, menopause doesn't have to be debilitating. And if it is, go see your GP and get some support.
Mm-hmm.
So I realize you focus on getting men and women back into the workforce, but you focus more on women. Is that right?
Yes. Just because there's more female clients here for getting back to work, but we also work with men.
Yeah. And do you feel like it's easier for men to get back into the workforce after time off, or does it just vary on the industry or their skill set or whatever?
Actually, I think it's harder for men here to get back into work after a career break.
Why is that?
Because biases again, people expect women, if they've taken a career break, to look after children. If men have taken a career break, there's so many biases around, is the helper doing all the work? Are they just on the golf course? Are they just being lazy? So employers have these biases, and it just makes it much harder for men to get back. So that's where, also I find with men moving here, if they're, following their wife, and that I see that happening more and more, and then, they take a few months off and they say, right, I want to get back to work, or they take a few years off, they maybe don't have the same networks that we have. So it's easier for a woman when you arrive here. You can meet people through the school. It's all set up for women to meet other people. Not as easy for men. So they struggle to find the friends groups here and to build the connections to get back to work.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't considered that, but that makes good sense. What advice would you have for somebody who's trying to get back into the workforce?
I think what was somebody to make a plan. So don't just rush and do your CV. Really have a think about what the right steps are for you, and getting that support can really help. And you don't have to pay for coaching. You can buy books on the subject, but really having that support so that you can think about what's the right next steps for you, and what are your key skills. And there's various ways you can focus on your key skills. There's online courses you can take to refresh your skills. Definitely getting something on your resume each year can help. So if you've got a big gap, look at what skills training you can do. And there's lots of opportunities to do that so that you can fill that gap by doing something useful that's going to help you find a job. That
was my next question, was what sort of skills training do you get people to do typically, and how long might a course be? Like, do you recommend people go back to do a full university degree, or do you do more short courses? And also, do you recommend any sort of volunteering or giving back to the community as a way to show their skill set?
It's a good question, Jules. And there's two angles to that. The first part is about specific skills for the role. So if they're not changing job completely, then we look at refreshing their skills. And I mean, there's never been a better time to refresh your skills. We used to have to pay a fortune for training courses and have to go and sit in the classroom and do, for days on end or weeks on end or months on end. Now, you can do everything online. You can basically sign up to online courses which are free or very reasonable at top universities, and they can last 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever. But you basically, as soon as you start doing that course, put it on your CV with this year's date and the name of the university that you're doing it with. So that's a great way to refresh your skills. And also, you can really take advantage of your career break to get new skills. So for example, if you work in HR, if you work in IT, you look at data analytics, people analytics, what are the latest technologies that people are using? That is a huge growth area. So you can actually do some training that's going to actually make you much more marketable than you were before you took the break.
Would you say most people you work with, you get them on short courses?
I would say yes, most of them. Other ones need something longer because they're changing, career altogether.
What would be the biggest career swap you've seen, apart from yourself going into banking to coaching? What advice do you have for me as I head to 60 years old and I'll be forced to retire from this job, but I actually need to continue working? And I'm 54 at the moment. So I've got 6 years, so I've got plenty of time to plan. What advice would you give me?
I would say you make a plan and really look at what you enjoy doing and where do you add the most value. And that's where, if you're not sure, ask people around you, and I'm sure they'll give you some really good answers. I can see you've got so many amazing skills, and you're already doing so many things that really make you marketable in 2019, 2020. So, you're definitely not behind the curve.
I'm not going to be unemployed at 61.
No. And I think the workforce is changing. And when you reach 60, you may find that you can work to 70, and even in your current profession, because a lot of professions are raising the upper age group for retirement.
Do you think that's happening in Hong Kong? I feel like it's not so much. I think it's happening in England and Australia and America, but not so much in Hong Kong.
Well, I have seen some financial services companies take on more seasoned employees. I've seen schools with more seasoned employees. So I think it is happening here, and I think it will happen more and more.
What might be the oldest age of somebody you've seen get back into the workforce, roughly?
I mean, in their 50s and 60s.
Okay. So people in their 60s getting back in the workforce. Because I've got a bit of a preconception in my mind that I'm really almost unhireable after 55. Do you know what I mean? Like, I really feel like I don't even feel like I could change jobs and go and teach in Australia necessarily after 55, because I feel like I just wouldn't get a look in, that somebody young and new and cheaper and out of university would get the job.
I mean, I really think you've got amazing skills, firstly. And secondly, I think employers, are really looking for more multi-generational teams, I think. And definitely as time goes on, senior women, more experienced women, and people of all diversity groups, because let's not just be specific on women here.
Yeah.
So really, they're looking at different cultures, different experiences, and you've got so much to add. So really, it's focusing on what you've got to add and value that you're adding. And you're learning so many different skills. You've got your teaching skill, you're amazing working with young people and supporting them. Then you've got your podcast series, and you've written your books, and you've got your daughter's doing amazing. So you've got so many great skills that the world is your oyster, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's just actually honing them in and working out exactly what I want to do. And I think that's probably the difficult thing. And that's why somebody like you would be so fantastic, because you would be able to help narrow down the skill set or expand on the skill set and then narrow down the choices and then help to make a decision. Because sometimes I find myself so indecisive. Do you come across many indecisive people that you really need to try and help them focus?
Yes. Yeah.
How do you do that?
As a coach, we have questioning techniques that would really challenge behaviors, challenge beliefs that are holding people back, and really create a plan and look at sticking to that plan. And then when they have a bit of a wobble, and we all have wobbles, we all have days when we think, why am I doing this? And that's where, getting back to that plan, getting back to, what are your key values? Why are you here? What's your mission in life? And being your authentic self and being clear on your values.
What if somebody came to you who had a great skill set, a fantastic experience in the past, they had a wonderful job, but they had lost all their confidence? What would you do to build somebody's self-confidence?
That is a lot of what we do. I think that's probably the main thing we do, actually, is helping people regain that confidence. And that is for my senior financial executive clients as well. It is not, people who have been never given up work. So it happens for them, and it happens for people returning to work. And that's where sometimes just somebody external looking at your CV, hearing your stories, and really actually sharing with you that, you've got amazing skills. Look at this amazing story. Why do you think that you're not good enough for this job, when actually what you've just told me is, you've got great skills and your specific experiences that are so good. And then we look at the crafting their stories and really getting the narrative right.
And I guess as you do that, then people can really see on paper or even hear how amazing they are and what opportunities are out there. And then you can slowly build their self-confidence so that they're ready to take that step.
Yeah, I do a lot of work, and then the internal barriers that hold people back at work. And women have quite a few of these barriers. Usually when I work with them and I talk about some of the barriers, and they say, yep, that is definitely me.
Can you give me an example of some of them?
So like not owning up to, when you've done something good. So really shouting out about it. We tend to think we just do a really good job, my boss will notice, and I'll get promoted. And that's not how you get on at work. You have to build your networks. You have to self-promote.
Yeah,
self-promote. and do it in a subtle way, because sometimes we don't like showing off. It's definitely been my sort of Scottish upbringing. We were definitely taught, young women should be seen and not heard, and don't speak until you're spoken to.
So you've got to break those old
Yeah.
patterns
Yes.
as well, don't you? And those sort of social norms that you've been
Yes.
taught when you were younger.
Yes.
Yeah.
So really sort of, sharing your successes, but owning up to those, and also asking for a promotion, asking for what you want. So often we just think we'll get it if we do a good job. Another thing is around ruminating. So, if we have an interview and something goes wrong, or we have a meeting and something goes wrong, we really focus on that and we think, oh my goodness, I said this. I've just ruined the whole relationship. And
it's a real skill not to do that,
Yes.
isn't it? You have to train yourself not
Yes.
to do it. It can take quite a while, but you can change it, can't you?
You can, because the other person will have forgotten all about it the next time you see them. But if the next time you see them, the first thing you think is, oh my God, I said the wrong thing in that meeting, this person doesn't like me, then you go into the next meeting and you hardly speak because you're so scared you're going to do something wrong again. And that person's forgotten all about it. So that can really hold us back.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're two really key factors that women do deal with. What about coping with rejection and when people put themselves out there, give it their best shot, and they don't get over the line?
Yeah.
How do you help people manage their rejection?
Well, that's where we really look into it in a bit of detail and say, okay, it didn't happen this time. Let's maybe look at why. Let's get some feedback. And sometimes the feedback is useful and sometimes it isn't useful. And we say, their view may not be your view and it may not be what I see. So, even if they don't think you're right for that role, that, you could be right for a similar role in another organization, or you could be right for another role in your organization. And that's a lot of what I do with people who are working, because the knee-jerk reaction when you go for a promotion and you don't get it is to think about going elsewhere.
I think it's also important to get that feedback, isn't it?
Yes.
Like, you don't want to be left wondering why you didn't get it. People
Yes.
should contact and ask for feedback.
Yes,
Do you recommend that?
I do. And it doesn't always happen, especially if you're dealing with recruiters here, not actually line managers, and you go through the recruiters. They're so busy that often you don't get that feedback. But that's where I would work with a client when we would go through, okay, what did you say? And then we say, it's just sometimes somebody who's more relevant for that particular, employer has got the job, but that doesn't mean that you haven't got the great skills.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you made a big mistake in the interview either.
Exactly. And I guess it then is about really building resilience. We've got to be able to bounce back from setbacks, don't we? And that can be a little bit harder when you're in menopause because
Yes.
you're more emotional and feel a bit more vulnerable and fragile. And I think that's something that would be really helpful to have a coach to be able to help with that, because sometimes people really struggle with that on their own. And I think that can stop people from even taking that first step to go back into the workforce, that fear of failure. But in actual fact, when we fail, we can actually learn so much more about ourselves than when we succeed. So a negative really can be turned into a positive, wouldn't you say?
Yes, definitely. And it's just being brave enough to take that step. And sometimes it's not listening to, some of the people around you that may not have your best interests at heart, So it might be easier for your partner for you to stay at home, might be easier for your family not to think about you having the stress of going back out to work. But actually, if you work with some mentors, coaches, people who can really help you do what's right for you, then that gives you that level of confidence and the support to take those steps.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Shirley, in your bio, you said something about how leaning in isn't an option for everybody. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, everybody thought it was great when Sheryl Sandberg wrote Lean In, and, which is very much don't, keep your career going. Don't just take a great big break. Really keep at it. Minimal time off, keep really focused in your job, keep your skills up to date. Well, I mean, that all sounds great, but we all have stories that have, where that's not been possible for us, where we've had to take a step back for various reasons and not been able to work full time. And sometimes we just need that for our mental health. We just need that break. And we deserve it if you've had worked for 15 years and then had children. Absolutely we should be focusing on our families. There's a lot of value to doing that.
That's something that is fine, isn't it? You've got to do what's right for you and what works best for you. And if it means taking time off or focusing on your children or retraining or whatever it is, then you just need to follow your instincts, don't you? And really do what's right for you. But I guess there's so many factors you've got to consider. Who's looking after the kids if you've got them, or whether you can afford it. Do you have a partner? Are you a single parent?
Yeah.
All of that can play into it. And your second child has some special needs. So did that mean that you weren't able to work full-time yourself because you needed to care for your child?
Yes, and it took a while, navigating, the therapist network in Hong Kong took a bit of time, because we didn't know what was wrong with him initially. It took a bit, and a lot of people saying there's nothing wrong. My child didn't speak to, he was 5, so yours will be the same.
But did you know deep down something wasn't right?
I knew there was something wrong 6 months. He just wasn't, he was screeching a lot, he wasn't meeting a lot of goals. And then we took him at 18 months and got him assessed, and they weren't quite sure. They thought it might be autism. So I read every book on autism. He was on all the diets and, we did all the therapy. And then it turned out at 3 years old, they said, actually, no, he has severe verbal dyspraxia, which meant he needs a lot of speech therapy. Now at 5.5, his speech is almost perfect. So our early intervention made a huge difference. He just has a couple of therapy sessions a week now.
See, that's very interesting as well. I have a friend who had a child with autism, and they did a lot of early intervention, and that child's doing very well now. So, yeah, the value in early intervention with stuff like that. But that would have meant that you had a lot of time running him around to doctors and tests and things like that. So
yeah, every day, taking him to therapists, we were working on all the exercises they gave. There's just no way I could have worked full time. I'm grateful that I had the time to be able to do that. I'm grateful that my husband was able to support us to do that. So, I know I'm one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, of course. And for some people, they don't have that option. But yes, there are many different circumstances which can mean that you can't go back to work until circumstances change. Even some parents with their children, not until they can start school. Once they start school and they're in full-time school, then the window opens for them to be able to go back to work. But before that, a lot of people can't do it.
Yes, and then some of them have never planned to go back to work, like, a fantastic of mine this year, whose husband sadly passed away at the end of last year.
Oh, no.
And, so she hadn't planned to go back to work, but suddenly financially she needed to. She's got 2 teenage children. And, we watched through that process. As soon as I met her, I thought, wow, you're amazing. And I always get inspired by my clients, but she was one of my most inspirational.
So you knew she'd get back into the workforce?
Yeah, I thought, what an asset she would be. Such an amazing, upbeat person who's been through such bad experience, but was still so driven. And just, somebody that as soon as you meet, you think this person's organized. They've had to be, they had to manage the finances, manage when her husband was sick. So they're super organized, super outgoing. I thought as soon as they get into the workforce, it should be fantastic. But it still took a while. It took a while finding employers who would interview her. And then also taking her through the interview technique, what things she should maybe say in interviews, the right kind of stories to give that could really support. Because one of the problems she had was if she started saying, yeah, my husband got sick, and I looked at him, she said, the interviewers got really upset and they got really distracted and they kept saying, I'm really sorry. And she said one time, the interviewer was starting to cry. So
did you advise her not to mention it then? Yeah.
I said, well, let's mention it in a really upbeat way. Yes, my husband passed away, which is sad, and now I'm doing this. So that, move on from it so that the interviewer doesn't start,
getting caught in it. Isn't that so funny? Oh my gosh. You can't predict how people are going to respond to different things, can you?
No.
So you've got to be ready for anything, which I'm sure that's part of what you do as well, is help people prepare. Shirley, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. This is super interesting. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover before we wind up?
I just want to really sort of say, if people are listening to this and thinking, I'm not sure if I want to go back to work, absolutely, this is the best time for women or for people to get back to work after a career break. Employers need that talent pool. Hong Kong especially, there are so many jobs out there. So really, and employers want to have senior women. They want to have more women in the workforce. So, there's a great opportunity for you.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
If people wanted to get in touch with you to get a bit of sort of support and coaching to reintegrate back into the workforce, how can they do that?
They can contact us through the Back to Work Hong Kong website, or we also have a very active Facebook group. So either of those ways, they can contact us.
Okay, brilliant. Shirley, I'm going to wrap up and say thank you so much to you now. But before we go, I'm going to ask you 4 secret questions for my Patreon supporters. So if my listeners out there, if you would like to hear Shirley's answers to the 4 secret questions, then please log on to Patreon and find Hong Kong Confidential. And for as little as $1 a month, you can listen to all of the secret questions with my guests over the last, it's about 6 weeks so far I've been doing it, and hear what their answers are to the questions. And if you could go to iTunes to rate and review us, that would be amazing. It'll help me get up the iTunes charts, and it will help more people get the message out about going back to work, and they'll be able to find Shirley if they need her support. And Shirley, thank you so much for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
been brilliant. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.